Welcome back. Well, it now seems, well, very likely that we as a country will be greylisted by what's called the Financial Action Task Force, because the task force believes we haven't done nearly enough to ensure that people cannot use our banks and our financial systems to launder money through our borders. And unfortunately, there have been plenty of warnings that this could happen and that there will be a big impact on our economy as a result. It will also mean that fewer people may want to invest here. In other words, the flow of money through South Africa will be affected. Advocate Paul Hoffman is the Director at Accountability Now, a Director. Paul, good afternoon to you. Do you believe this is going to happen, that there's no way for us to avoid being greylisted by the task force?
Well, if we carry on with our current trajectory, Stephen, I'm afraid that the Director of our Financial Intelligence Centre must be right when she says it's inevitable that we will be greylisted. And that is a great pity, because all of the features that you mentioned in the introduction basically mean that there will be fewer jobs and more poverty in South Africa. The effect on the gross domestic product of the country is usually around 1%. And if we get a setback of 1% to our GDP, we are basically looking at less than a percentage of growth in the year ahead. That's also terrible economic news.
Who do you blame for this? I mean, in a way, this has been one of those train crashes happening in slow motion. We've known this direction for quite a while. Who do you think is responsible?
I'm afraid it's the dithering, the paralysis, if you like, of the cabinet in South Africa. They've sought to develop a workaround solution by rapidly introducing some legislation in relation to terrorism and money laundering, which is the topics that concern the Financial Action Task Force. And I'm afraid that isn't actually the problem. The problem is that although we have good anti-corruption laws in South Africa, we do not have the entity that is required to enforce those laws, which is really a great pity, because the Constitutional Court has set the criteria, made the requirements known in binding terms, which have been ignored not only by the Zuma administration, which was perhaps understandable, but also by the Ramaphosa administration, which says it has no plans to reform our criminal justice administration, which, as it is currently constituted, is clearly incapable of enforcing laws against money laundering and terrorism financing.
You make the point. I mean, I understand during the sort of state capture era, if we can call it that for a moment, that, you know, money was in a way leaving the country, and we know at one point that the Guptas were able to get around 7 billion rand out of the country, and therefore it might not have been a priority. It's quite strange that President Ramaphosa, who's been promising renewal, anti-corruption agenda, etc., since 2018, since what, February 2018, 4 years ago, still hasn't been able to pass the required laws.
It goes back even further. When he gave his victory speech at Nasrec in December 2017, he said, we're going to fight corruption like we fight poverty, inequality, and joblessness. Well, I don't know what he actually meant about it, but what I do know is that very little has been done to fight corruption. And it gets compounded by the fact that in August 2020, the National Executive Committee of the ANC passed a resolution which effectively told Cabinet to straighten up, fly right, and implement the requirements of the Constitutional Court in the Glenister cases. That hasn't been done either. In fact, a month before last, Ronald Lamola says there are no plans to reform the criminal justice administration.
We've had National Treasury talking about this, and in fact the Director General, Ismail Moniat, himself has spoken many times about how important it is to get all of this right, just in the last 6 months or so. The proposed legislation, I think, was kicked out by the Parliamentary Committee yesterday. It seemed to be overbroad. It seemed to suggest that if you form a local singing club, you would have to register that with the Department of Social Development. Was that bill, those proposals, just wrong-headed? Were they going too far? I imagine it would be possible to go too far.
I think that, yes, certainly they're not going to pass constitutional muster in their present form, nor in, procedurally speaking, in the way that they've been presented in our participatory constitutional democracy. But really, they are pretending that the problem is that we don't have sufficient laws against corruption in South Africa. The common law, we've got fraud and theft and embezzlement and all manner of crimes would fit into the description of money laundering and terrorist financing. And it's the enforcement aspect that is actually concerning the FATF. And if government hasn't worked that out, then it is willful blindness rather than a wrong assessment of what is required.
Advocate Paul Hoffman, a Director at Accountability Now. Thanks very much indeed. More on this story in The Pulse in an hour and a half from now.